Hello, everyone. I'm here today with Lawrence Gouston, who is a professor at Georgetown and Georgetown Law and one of the top experts in quarantines. So, Lawrence, thank you for joining us. Would love for you to share a little bit of the background about yourself and what you do at Georgetown Law.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm a professor of global health law at Georgetown University and the director of the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law at Georgetown. And I'm also the director of the World Health Organization Center on Global Health Law. I've worked with CDC, NIH, WHO for many, many years now in relation to all global health matters, and very happy to be with you. Did I lose you?
We're facing something that people have never had to experience before here in the US or around the world, which is COVID-19, otherwise known as coronavirus, is we're now starting to see quarantines. What is a quarantine?
Well, you know, there's been a lot of sloppy use of that term. The technical word quarantine actually comes from medieval times when ships used to be trying to get into a particular country, and they would be made to wait outside in the waters before entering the country for a period of 40 days, because they figured that within 40 days, that's quarantine, within 40 days, people would either die, or if they were well, they could come aboard. And so quarantine basically is used as a medical term in terms of isolation and quarantine. If you've got an infectious disease like COVID-19, then you would be medically isolated for the period of time when you're contagious. And if you're knowingly exposed, but not yet diagnosed with COVID-19, then you can be quarantined for a period of the longest possible period of incubation of the disease, which is 14 days in this case. And so technically, quarantine is literally if we know that you're exposed. But it's been now used in many, many broad ways. So for example, we've used it as a part of kind of stay-at-home orders, because New York and many parts of the country, probably the majority of the population in the country now, are under either compulsory or voluntary stay-at-home orders so that they can't come home. A lot of people call that quarantine. The president recently said that he might quarantine New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, although he's now pulled back from that. That's more like what we call a cordon sanitaire. It's a kind of a guarded area where no one can enter or exit. And so, you know, for somebody that, you know, knows public health law, these terms are used sloppily. You know, sometimes it's quarantine, sometimes it's shelter in place, sometimes stay-at-home order, sometimes mass quarantine. But essentially, you have to look very carefully about what the government is trying to do and to find out what your rights are.
How do you find out what your rights are? Because we've seen, you know, people being told to quarantine that haven't quarantined. So I think there's confusion over whether it is a suggestion versus required. We're seeing states now threaten a fine or an arrest. I just saw in another country in South Africa an article where they had apparently charged 2 tourists with attempted murder for actually leaving quarantine. So like, what are the civil or the legal, potential implications from this? And when do you have to obey it?
Well, I mean, charging somebody with attempted murder for breaching a quarantine is a little bit extreme, but it depends. You see, in the United States, all public health powers, or most public health powers, reside with the states and cities. And so when a governor issues a stay-at-home order, it'll be different in different states. Some states and some cities, like in San Francisco, made it a misdemeanor. So it's a compulsory order. New York is now a compulsory order. We've just heard where I live in Maryland, a governor is making it into a compulsory order tonight. It used to be an advisory. So you have to look at what your state says. But whether you're being strongly advised to stay home or whether you're being required to stay home, you should stay home. We know that COVID-19 is a highly contagious infectious disease. We know that it's a serious disease that can cause hospitalizations and even deaths. And so whether you're being asked to do so from a moral or ethical point of view or from a legal point of view, we need uniform compliance by the entire American public, but we're not seeing that. We're seeing a patchwork instead. Some states are doing nothing, other states are being very tough. Some people are breaching quarantines. For example, in New York, somebody's family's just hired an RV and are planning on driving out west. So, for me, America's very often been a state where, what are my rights? What does government owe me? But I think we need to begin asking another question: what do I owe to my fellow human being? I have a moral duty to protect myself, to protect my family, protect my community, and to make sure that we have a safe country. And so I think we need to recapture that lost tradition of the common good.
I think that is important, especially in times like this. Are there any circumstances where an order for quarantine could be implemented, even if it's a mandatory, but whether it's under state law, the Constitution, there would be a reason why somebody could actually violate that quarantine? Medical emergency or something to that effect. And then the other question I have for you is, do you feel that states should be doing the same type of quarantines? Is it confusing when people are learning about all different variations being rolled out across the country?
Yeah, I mean, if you're under a quarantine order, you should obey it, of course, and the law requires it. But if you look at most of the shelter-in-place or stay-at-home orders, they almost all have exceptions for essential purposes. So, for example, you need food. You probably might need to go out to the shops. You might have emergency treatments. You might have to go to the hospital. These things are understandable. On the question of uniformity, yes, it's a very, American federalism is our great strength and our great weakness. States are the great laboratories of innovation, but now we're seeing a patchwork across the United States. And unfortunately, a microbe like SARS-CoV-2, which causes the COVID-19 disease, doesn't respect borders, doesn't respect international borders. It certainly doesn't respect state borders. And so we should have a more national uniform approach, but we don't.
What is the effect on organizations with the quarantine, whether it's logistics, services, supplies? Also, I think this is totally new for employers to understand, how do I run my business in a quarantine? What can I obligate my employees to do? And then if I'm an employee, how do I comply or not comply or even know my rights. So I actually have a relative who works for a company that supplies airplane parts, and they got them, and so they got themselves categorized as an essential business, and she's being told, hey, I have to go into work, but I don't feel safe going into work, like, so how do we deal with these issues? What's going on?
Well, first of all, we've talked about quarantines and stay-at-home orders, but we haven't actually talked about something that's actually, different, which is throughout the United States, governors and mayors have asked businesses to close, to change their operations, to go to remote um, uh, work activities. And these things, and government does have the power to do that. Cities and states have long been had responsibility for regulating and even closing businesses, and so we're seeing that now. Um, from the business point of view, the important thing is that if somebody can work remotely, they should. Um, if somebody is an essential worker that needs to be at work, um, then consistent with what your state law or your city ordinance says, you need to keep them safe at work by rigorous hygiene, disinfection, separating people in the workplace so that nobody's closer than 6 feet apart, um, and being highly responsible. Now, many of the orders that require business to change operations make explicit exemptions for essential services, food, medical supplies, uh, trucking and transport, healthcare settings, first responders. And so if your company is doing something that's essential for the public good, maybe making ventilators, they may well be exempt from some of the more strict requirements that government is placing on businesses at the moment. And of course, we need to prepare for when we're back to work. Um, President Trump recently said he wanted America back to work by Easter. Now he's saying the end of April. But at some point, we will be shifting toward going back to work. And when we do so, we're going to have to make very, very stringent efforts to make back to work safe, or at least as safe as we possibly can.
Do you think there's liability for employers if they don't make it a safe environment? And I think some of them are trying to navigate, how do I make it a safe environment, especially if there's no hand sanitizer, disinfectant, gloves, masks, all these things that don't exist. How do you, what's that issue? Because we've heard a lot of stories, whether it's from employees or employers talking to us. It could be at-risk employees with chronic conditions or other things that are being mandated to come into work, but they're not necessarily given the protective equipment or the safeties there to make sure they don't get infected with COVID-19.
Well, there certainly is a liability risk, and the best way of trying to avoid or at least mitigate that liability risk is to take the precautions that the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, recommends. They have quite detailed guidelines for safe workplaces. They should be followed. Um, you know, I don't know that it's necessary to have gloves and masks, but it's certainly important to have plenty of soap, water, and disinfectant, including Purell and other kinds of products that employees could use. I think there's going to need to be special dispensation for people at high vulnerability categories, like the elderly, people with major respiratory or other chronic diseases, or people who are on immunodepressed, for example, because they've been on cancer therapy. All of these things, I think employers are going to have to do well. They're going to have to keep people safe by social distancing them within the workplace, and also by making sure that there's good hygiene and disinfection in the workplace. I know I'm advising Georgetown University, and they're a major employer, and we're trying to keep everybody very safe. And at the moment we've only got essential workers that are working. Everyone else is remote, and we're paying everybody.
Do you feel that, is there a chance, because I think everyone's following the CDC's recommendations.
Well, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true at all.
But
I think everyone should. I think everyone should follow them. I don't think everyone is following them.
that is absolutely correct. What I meant to say is, if people, we know they should follow the CDC guidelines, but if they do, is there still a potential for liability with an employer because they followed the guidelines, and it's, and employees sue later on because it could have been deaths or sickness, and they are able to say they should have gone beyond what the CDC said?
Well, it's a very good question. Theoretically, if you follow good public health guidelines, evidence-based, you should be all right liability-wise. But we've certainly seen courts require companies to go above and beyond those guidelines. Let's just put it this way. If you're rigorously following those guidelines, you're doing a good job, and you're doing what you should be doing. I know occasionally with Georgetown University or other employers, I do recommend some evidence-based, overly precautionary measures. But one needs to follow good medical advice. But the bottom line is follow CDC's guidelines meticulously at a minimum, and then if you have good justification for going beyond them, just to be on the safe side, you won't be criticized for that.
What is the potential exposure or liability for employers who just don't follow the CDC's guidelines and just continue business as normal?
I think it's significant liability exposure because the company is knowingly placing their employees at risk of harm, and that the harm is preventable, or at least could be mitigated. And if the employer takes no effort to do that and violates public health standards, and somebody became ill, I do believe that there would be a liability risk.
Is there a certain point where that actually kicks in? And what I mean is, we just had this pandemic come here just recently. So at what point should employers actually know that they have to protect? Is there a specific date, whether it was a CDC announcement or something, of where at this point in time, this is when you need to be protecting your employees? And then does that change on an ongoing basis as new guidance comes out or new information that requires additional measures?
Yes, of course it does. It requires all employers to be fully up to date with CDC and their state and local government guidelines. Not just CDC, but you should also look at guidelines issued by the state and locality. Certainly follow those guidelines, and sometimes you're going to be ordered to do so. And if there's a legal or regulatory standard and you don't follow that standard, that exposes you to even greater liability. And so, yes, as guidelines change, as new scientific evidence becomes available, because remember, there's a lot we don't know, and we're learning about COVID-19. You need to be up to date on public health recommendations.
If a company, there's a quarantine in effect, how does the company determine, am I essential business or can I apply to be an essential business?
Well, it depends on, it depends on which state you are. The Department of Homeland Security does have information on its website to suggest what it defines as essential work. But you'd also need to look at the state and local government and the CDC guidelines, because they're usually fairly specific in it. And if in doubt, ask state and local authorities whether or not you would be exempt and under what conditions.
So if you were to apply to be an essential, let's say service, is that, for people who don't know, is that applying to the federal government? Is it the state? Is it the city? Do you have to apply to everyone? And
yeah, there is no one size fits all, because remember, we're talking about many different laws, many different guidelines, and so if you're under if you're under a city mandated or state mandated order to close the business or to change business operations, that would be the legal entity that you'd need to gain dispensation from. And normally, businesses aren't regulated, certainly not closed by the federal government, but they are regulated. You can be regulated by OSHA, or you can be regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, depending upon what business you're in. And so, in all of those cases, you need to be in compliance with state, local, and federal requirements. This is nothing new for employers. They're used to doing that.
so, something that came up just the other day was a company talking about how they were in a quarantine, zone, and how they were dealing for the first time of not being able to get to their manufacturing plant or having permission to move around the state. So I think there's going to be a lot of challenges that companies experience that they haven't had to before. But if somebody was, potentially an essential business or service, and their business was in LA, and let's say LA has a quarantine, California has a quarantine, and they needed to move product to Washington that has a quarantine and to Seattle, do they have to apply to every city government and state government all along that route to get permission? And then along with that, do they need to get some type of a certification for their employee to be determined that also?
It really depends. It really depends upon what the rule is and what they're trying to do. For the most part, when we have these stay-at-home orders, which really is a more precise way of saying it than a quarantine. If you've got a stay-at-home order, then then you're exempt for certain essential purposes from that order. So, say you're in New York and kind of you're a health worker or you're a trucker. I think one would just simply want to have some documentation that you're covered by that exemption. It's not really, people are, at the moment in the United States, it's not like in many other countries where they're stopping vehicles and they're kind of checking whether you're an essential worker. But if you are stopped, you do need to be prepared to demonstrate that you're operating within a category that's exempt from the requirements.
Typically, would that just be a letter from your employer, or it have to be from a government entity?
There is no typical, but as far as I'm aware, most states aren't requiring you to apply to the government for an exemption. They're just saying you're exempt if you're in these industries.
Are states allowed to bar entry into other states? Like, here in Florida, they were stopping people coming in from Louisiana.
Yeah, no, they're not. States are not allowed to bar people from other states because the power to regulate interstate commerce is exclusively with the Congress of the United States. So states have no such power to do that. And I think, so in some places, they're stopping people with with New York license plates, and then, questioning them, potentially quarantining them. That can be problematic. So no, states do not have the power to regulate commerce across state lines, but they do have power within their own state.
Does the president have that power, or does Congress actually need to regulate that power if it's stopping people traveling between states?
It's the exact right question to ask. It's Congress.
And if you're an employee, and let's say you're at risk because you're elderly or you have a respiratory or chronic condition, is there any right for you not to go to work? And can you say you're not going to go to work? What legal protections are there for the employees?
Well, again, you're making generalized assumptions that all states are different. But if there's a stay-at-home order, then you're going to have to stay at home. If you're vulnerable, in a vulnerable position, and you're being asked to go to work, I think you would need to inform your employer and have the employer make a determination. We're going through this at Georgetown University and every other university and businesses. People are saying, well, I shouldn't have to do it because I have X. Sometimes it's highly justified. If you've got, a chronic respiratory disease, you're probably at very, very high risk. If you're elderly and have respiratory disease, even higher risk. But a lot of people saying, well, I'm fearful, I'm worried, I don't want to go to work. Well, is that enough? So I think these are determinations that need to be made between the employer and the employee.
How does the employer deal with the fact that you've got HIPAA and privacy, so you can't necessarily ask your employees, do you have a chronic condition? Because I'm also sure that employers are dealing with the issue of, anyone could just come up and say, I'm at risk, I'm vulnerable, and therefore you need to, have me work from home.
Well, I mean, you do have to abide by the HIPAA regulation in terms of privacy. But if somebody's coming to you and volunteering that they have a certain condition, that's lawful. Anybody is legally able to disclose what would otherwise be confidential because it's their information, it's their body. But the employer can't ask.
Are there any other, considerations, questions, or things that organizations should think about in regards to quarantines?
I think the main thing to think about is just follow the science, follow the evidence, and get your scientific information from reliable sources. And those reliable sources are principally the CDC and your state and local health department. And when in doubt about that, I would consult one of those two.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and we really appreciate you joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me.